This is video number 5 on the topic of what is cancer and why did I specifically get it. Here you can learn about me, how I have handled and am handling being diagnosed with a brain tumour, and my discoveries about cancer specifically and health in general. My name is Peter Beaton, and I believe that if you're not willing to teach yourself and learn about your own body and your own health, then maybe no one can really help you. But if you are willing to teach yourself and learn about your own body and your own health, then maybe no one can stop you. The following lays out my own perspective on what adult cancer is and why I think that I got it. I have a feeling that cancers of childhood are different. I do not have such strong theories about what childhood cancers are, so I suggest that you consider childhood cancers and adult cancers as separate diseases. I do. I am ruminating here on the kinds of cancers that become more common as we get older. You may think to yourself, no need to think about what cancer actually is because the medical profession knows all about this, so I don't need to. Well, the story of the investigations into cancer is pretty interesting and the end result may surprise you. The first real theory of what cancer actually is that the medical profession brought into wholeheartedly is the theory that cancer is caused by excessively growing and dividing cells. Sounds pretty logical. This led to the development of drugs that would kill growing and dividing cells more quickly than they would kill normal cells, a selective toxin, which eventually led to the development of chemotherapy during and just after the Second World War, which targeted growing, dividing cells. Of course, most cells in our body do grow and divide, so the trick was to find a chemical that killed cancer cells marginally faster than it killed all the other cells in the body. Hopefully, the patient doesn't quite die before all the cancer cells die. It's a horrible therapy to undergo, and even if it is possible to basically take the patient as close to death as possible and then bring them back again, then A, the patient is often damaged permanently, and B, in theory, even if one cancerous cell remains after the therapy, then the cancer will eventually regrow anyway, and C, the chemotherapeutic chemicals themselves turned out to be cancer-causing agents in the longer term. Also, the actual growth of a tumour is rarely what kills people. There are some tumours that grow to be very large, yet the person doesn't die. No, the real big killer is the metastatic spread of malignant cancers. If your basic theory of something is wrong, then trying to treat the outcome on that incorrect basis is never going to work in the larger scale. Cancer is obviously something to do with the cells that grow and divide too much, but the actual growing and dividing itself isn't the actual cause. Something else is causing the growth. The obvious failure eventually of the chemotherapeutic approach to even dent the rise of the cancer mortality statistics, along with the development of advanced techniques and instruments that can investigate the genes in our cells' DNA, led to the second great theory of cancer that the worldwide medical profession bought into, the genetic mutation cause of cancer. As genetic analysis became firstly possible in the first place, then faster and cheaper, it became obvious that pretty much every cancer cell had unexpected mutations in the genes of that cell. These mutations caused the cells to stop self-destructing when they should have, or to divide too many times, or to consume more glucose than they should have, etc., etc. All that was required, it was assumed, was to identify the DNA mutation, develop a drug that could attach to that particular DNA mutation to turn it off, and hey presto, a completely targeted therapy that didn't kill the patient while it did kill the cancer. Even though these targeted drugs were horrendously expensive, they were mostly either completely ineffective. There were one or two rare cancers that were, in the end, solely due to a single genetic mutation, as it happens. The pharmaceutical companies knew that these cancers would be the equivalent of picking low-hanging fruit. These genetically targeted therapies worked, but only for those rare cancers. So barely effective, or at best marginally effective, in that they reduced the cancer burden in the patient's body for a short time, a month or 3. But then the cancer resumed its relentless march and the patient died anyway. Turns out, in the vast majority of cancers, especially solid tumor-forming cancers, that the genetic DNA mutations varied so much from patient to patient, all with apparently identical tumor types, that it wouldn't be possible to produce a drug that tackled all of them, or even to tackle most of them. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of these DNA mutations. Then it was discovered that even within the same tumor of the same patient, different tumor cells side by side could have completely different mutations in their DNA. So it would literally be impossible to have any drug that could be effective. To repeat myself, if your basic theory of a disease or condition is wrong, then trying to treat it is never going to work in the larger scale. That cancer is something to do with mutations and DNA damage became obvious, but those mutations and DNA damage aren't the basic cause. Something else is causing the mutations and the DNA damage. Even if you still think that cancer is a genetic disease, well, even the whole medical profession no longer does. There wasn't a big announcement or anything, but around 2010 to 2014, it became obvious to everything that it was just wrong. They just didn't know what it was. They had to rely on surgery and the old stalwarts of radiotherapy and chemotherapy to try and kill the growing cells. In the end, though, the medical profession just isn't working on any basis or any sound basis of the root cause of cancer. They know the previous theories don't work, and they're now left using the cut, burn, poison techniques that have changed little in nearly 60 years. So if cancer is something to do with growth, but growth isn't the underlying cause, and if cancer is something to do with genetic DNA mutations, but those gene mutations are not necessarily the underlying cause, then what actually is the underlying cause? My theory, based on all my reading and research, is that there is almost always a low-level and chronic toxic source that slowly but surely damages the mitochondria of cells, which, if the damage continues for too long, leads to the creation of higher levels of reactive oxygen ions inside that mitochondrion. These super-reactive oxygen atoms are always there in a certain amount, but too many of them for too long increases the chance that they will react with things that they shouldn't, particularly DNA. This can potentially lead to mutations in the DNA, which again always happens anyway at a low level, and there are constant mechanisms in every cell designed to check for and correct and neutralize these mutations. But the chronic overproduction of reactive oxygen ions and the consequent chronically raised level of mutations caused to the DNA increases the chance that a DNA mutation is produced that allows the cell to convert to fermentation of glucose even in the presence of oxygen. And at roughly the same time, another mutation that switches off the self-destruct process that all cells have to stop damaged cells continuing to live and harming their neighboring cells. Various other mutations will also occur in a combination that is highly unlikely, but given that the attack by these excessive reactive oxygen ions continues for long enough in enough cells of an organ or even in the whole body that it eventually produces a cell that can constantly divide without limit, will need and use lots of glucose to ferment for its energy, and can break away and circulate in the bloodstream, resisting the immune system's attempts to kill it, and eventually lodge somewhere else and start dividing again without limit, i.e. the cancer has metastasized. Remember that so-called benign tumours do not metastasize, but malignant tumours do. By and large, benign tumours do not kill the patient. It is almost always the malignant ones that do. That is why early detection is so important in, for example, breast cancer. Find the cancer before it metastasizes, cut it out, and hopefully you've got it. You haven't addressed the root cause of why you've got it, but the immediate danger has been resolved. So remember, my hypothesis is that the vast majority of cancers, especially metastatic cancers that are diagnosed more frequently as people get older, arise because of a long exposure to a low-grade toxin, a mild toxin, that then causes genetic DNA damage and mutations that then leads to the excessive growth and metastatic spread that are the hallmarks of the awful rise in cancer deaths across the whole world, especially over the past 130 years or so. If I'm right, then the type of root cause is now correctly identified. But what actually is this toxin? Well, firstly, consider lung cancer and smoking. Maybe only 10% of smokers will get lung cancer. So my hypothesis is that it is possible that there is a genetic predisposition for the cells of the lung linings to absorb or be sensitive to the toxins in the cigarette smoke more in more people than others. So the chronic exposure to the low-level toxic substances in cigarette smoke leads to cancer in the lungs of those individuals who are genetically predisposed to have lung lining cells that absorb the toxin more readily than in other people's lungs, about 1 in 10 people. If you have this genetic mutation but you do not smoke, then you do not get lung cancer. And if you do not have this genetic mutation but you do smoke, the toxins in the smoke are more likely to cause other health problems but not lung cancer. This sounds almost obvious, but my hypothesis is that this chronic low-level toxin exposure model applies to all adult onset metastatic cancers, especially those that occur more frequently from our 30s onwards. So 1, there is a chronic exposure to a low-level toxin of some kind. 2, there is a genetic predisposition for certain cell types in either one individual's body or organ to absorb this toxin more than other cell types. 3, the mitochondria in those cells get damaged, and this leads to increased levels of genetic mutations, which after a period of time creates, number 4, at least one cell with just the right set of mutations so that it can multiply indefinitely, powering itself by the fermentation of glucose, even though there is plenty of oxygen available, without 5, the immune system being able to either detect it or kill it, and 6, developing the ability to detach itself from its original tissue of origin and travel via the bloodstream to a new site where it can set up a new cancer colony, i.e. metastatic spread. So if my hypothesis is correct, and I believe it is, if the actual toxin can be identified, it can be avoided, because the genetic susceptibility of a certain type of cell to absorb a toxin more than normal only causes a problem if the toxin is actually there in the first place. And thus, the risk of cancer developing in the future is either reduced dramatically or even eliminated. So, cigarette smoke is an obvious one. If you're a smoker and you're watching this, you're literally wasting your time. You already know what to do, and obviously choose not to. Your choice. Another classic toxin from the old cancer case files is chimney soot. One of the case reports from early cancer research was about the young boys who were the chimney sweeps in old London. They became increasingly diagnosed with a rare form of cancer in their scrotum, which, it was eventually discovered, was caused by the combination of being constantly covered in soot and never getting any opportunity to wash properly. So the constant irritation of the soot over a couple of years, concentrated by the folds in the scrotum, was a low-level toxin, which eventually led to cancer of the scrotum. Once the correct root cause of this cancer was identified, legislation protected these boys, and better hygiene conditions like regular proper washing led to the complete disappearance of this cancer. Also, there are a few viruses which can set up a chronic presence in the body and have a low-level toxic effect in the tissue where they set up, HPV for example. And consider sunlight. I do not believe that a normal exposure to the sun is bad, quite the opposite. But if you push it and get sunburn, and then it happens in the same place over and over again over many years, this chronic exposure to a low-level toxic process can lead to skin cancer in those individuals genetically susceptible to that kind of cell damage. So the cigarette smoke, the soot, the viruses, the repeated sunburn all fit into my hypothesis. But they cannot account for the tsunami of cancer that we are living through. Almost 50% of adults in the Western world will receive a cancer diagnosis, and about 50% of those will die of it. The missing toxin is, I firmly believe, raised blood glucose levels. We are designed by evolution to have a small, fairly steady level of blood glucose all the time. But the so-called Western diet has elevated everybody's level of blood glucose to frightening levels all the time. Elevated blood glucose is well known to be mildly toxic, and our exposure to the elevated levels are now chronic from childhood on through to adult life, etc. The three main culprits are: number one, sugar itself, and number two, the added sugars in products, and number three, refined carbohydrates, especially those that come from grains, which our bodies react to exactly as if it was pure sugar. Sugar itself can be consumed on its own, kind of, like added to tea or coffee, or in cereals, or in artificial drinks like colas or beers. Even freshly squeezed fruit juice with no extra sugar added in is still basically a pure sugar drink. All the fibre has been broken up or removed. All these things spike up our blood glucose horribly. Then the food manufacturers add sugar to products like tomato sauce or mayonnaise or ice cream or chocolate or cottage cheese, for example, often to improve the taste, because the disastrous move to low-fat foods left the resulting fat-reduced food tasting awful and not selling. So sweet things sell really well. Humans love it. We are genetically programmed by evolution to love it, since we were made in an environment that naturally has very low levels of sugar out there. A human ancestor of 1 million or 2 years ago, who could maybe eat some sugar from fruits in autumn, could thus pack on a few extra pounds of fat, since sugar in our diet is converted into fat, of course, which then acts as an extra store of energy reserves for the potentially harsh winter ahead. So, sugar itself can be a source of a chronic low-level toxin. And added sugar can be another source of a chronic low-level toxin. Finally, refined carbohydrates. All the things we love to eat. Bread, cakes, biscuits and crackers, pasta, batter, pie crusts, pastry, pizzas, breakfast cereals. All these products are digested by our bodies as if they were sugar from the moment it goes into your mouth, never mind into the stomach, then into the gut. So the bad news is, all the things that everybody loves about our modern diet, sugar, added sugar, refined carbohydrates, matron grains, are also the fundamental root cause of the awful rise in cancer diagnoses and fatalities over the past 150 years ago. But there is good news. If you firstly are aware of this, and secondly have the motivation to do something about it, i.e. switch to some form of low carbohydrate way of eating, then you have a chance of avoiding this cliff edge. This knowledge came too late for me. In terms of having a chronic, low-level toxic lifestyle, I was full on. I smoked from the age of 14, and even before that, I was a high-carb eater. I loved my ice cream, biscuits. I always had a dessert at meal times, and boy oh boy did I eat a lot of bread. Breakfast was always 2 sandwiches, that's 4 slices of bread, bacon butties or something. Lunch was always sandwiches, chicken favourite was always a favourite. I always had 4 slices of bread with my dinner as an accompaniment, whatever the dinner was. And most nights I'd have an evening sandwich before bed. I would have laughed out loud at anyone who dared to suggest that this was an unhealthy way of eating. I occasionally did it, actually. That what I ate would have anything to do with my health was just a foreign concept. You want to be healthy? Go exercise, was my way of thinking. After about 30 years I stopped smoking, which was a positive step forward, but I kept my foot on the pedal of sugar, added sugar, refined carbohydrates from grains for another 10 years or so. By the time that my dad's death prompted me to do some actual research and eventually led me to modify my way of eating to low carb and then keto, it was too late. The damage that our modern, chronically low-level toxic diet causes is small, tiny at each meal, but it is mostly irreversible, and it builds up slowly and relentlessly over the years and decades until something breaks. The seeds of cancer in my brain had been sown. I cannot prove it, but I now believe that my brain tumor began probably 5 years ago, maybe more, and grew slowly over the intervening years. There are some fast-growing gliomas, and I can't prove that I didn't have one of those, but for various reasons, I believe that my one grew very slowly. As my way of eating changed, perhaps I slowed its growth somewhat, maybe not. Eventually, it caught up with me, as you know. How can I know if all this theory of the underlying root cause of cancer is even a little bit right? Well, there are plenty of high-end medical people coming to the same conclusion, and their numbers are increasing. And even if I'm somewhat right, then my own approach to my own cancer diagnosis and my path following on from surgery will be an extra piece of evidence. We'll see. I hope you keep watching to find out. So, if you or a loved one has cancer, then I know exactly how you feel. I'm not a doctor, I'm not giving medical advice, I am simply sharing knowledge and experience that I believe can help you know and understand that there are lots of practical things that you can do for yourself or your loved one to help deal with this thing, over and above what the mainstream medical system can offer. Hope is not a strategy, but learning, researching, actively helping yourself, and not just taking even a doctor's advice without critically thinking about it, certainly is a strategy. If you want to do one further thing to help you understand evolution and cancer, read The Cancer Code, a new book by Dr. Jason Fung.